So we'll start just some warm-up sorts of things to get comfortable answering questions. What's the best dish you make?
Oh, well, that's easy. We, because we have to get all our food down in the Galapagos, basically what we get is tuna and rice and oatmeal. So we're there on the islands for as long as 3 and 4 months. Mm-hmm. So we take down what we call a tuna repair kit. And a tuna repair kit consists of herbs and spices and Indian spices so that we can make the tuna and rice dish taste a little bit different every evening. And we eat porridge for breakfast.
Okay.
So we have oats, which we make with porridge, and we have cans of milk, which actually is, I think, sort of originally a sort of baby formula thing, which was the nearest dried milk we could get down there.
So are you sick of tuna at this point, or are you?
We never eat tuna when we get away from the islands.
Well, fresh tuna we have, but not out of a can.
Not out of a can,
right.
But that was the only food we could get to take out.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And when you're back home and you have everything at your disposal, yes. What's the best dish that you make generally?
A boiled egg.
No, that's not true. We actually eat quite a lot of Indian food. So
excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Also fish.
Fish. We
a lot of fish, just as long as it's not canned.
So another culinary question: if you could go back in time and have a beer with anybody in history, who would you sit down and have a beer with?
I'd like to talk to Darwin.
Yeah.
I mean, there are many people who would be interesting to talk to, going much further back in time than that. But Darwin, because of the work we've done on the Galapagos, would be a very interesting person to talk to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What would you ask him?
You say go back in time, but what I've often said when I was teaching undergraduates is imagine what it must be like to talk to Darwin or anybody else who could come into the present. Mm-hmm. And what would you tell him, and what questions would you ask him? That's what I pose to the undergraduates. And that way of thinking about it allows you to say what you know about the world now,
right,
and get his reaction and ask him what kinds of questions would you be asking if you knew what we do know now. And I think that's a very stimulating way of probing one's understanding of the role of an historical factor in our understanding of biology.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is there a favorite question that you've gotten from students that they channeled their inner Darwin and sort of assumed maybe he would ask?
Usually they're private ones, they're personal ones, I should say.
Okay.
They're not so much the professional ones, would you do experiments on
right,
it and so on.
Okay.
It would be more like, what was it like to live, what was it like to be on the Beagle?
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think that, if we could get him up to speed in a few months, what would be the first thing that he might tackle?
Oh, I think I could
sure.
answer that. I mean, I think Darwin would be absolutely thrilled about several of our findings. I hope he would be absolutely thrilled with, but I think he would be really especially thrilled with being able to put observations from the field into a genetic context. Mm-hmm. And now we've been so lucky to be able to do this through collaborations. We now have whole genome sequences of the birds. And I think Darwin would be fascinated to see the genetic underpinning of many of his ideas. But this would be a marvelous discussion. Yeah.
Indeed.
I think that also he would be very interested to know what he got wrong. First of all, we would be saying, you said this and that's right, and you said that and that's right. And I think he would be very curious to know, well, I hardly knew a fraction of what you now know. What I'd like to know is, where was I wrong? Mm-hmm. And there are not very many basic principles that he did not understand, given what he knew at that time. I suppose one obvious thing that he didn't know was how fast evolution can occur in contemporary time. He has a phrase which I can't remember exactly, but it is to the effect that we only see the evidence of evolution over a long period of time, when evolution has caused a change of organisms of a small extent. He had no idea that, for one thing, he didn't know about bacteria and the rate at which generation by generation they can change so quickly, let alone vertebrate animals like birds.
And the other thing that I'm thinking now back to the one and only diagram he did in his book, which was really very nice, a little tree-like diagram, phylogenetic tree. But now, of course, we know, first of all, with plants, but now with animals, we know the power of gene flow from one species to another. Even though it's just a trickle, it can, under certain ecological conditions, take off in a new direction. So I think he would be fascinated by the fact of small trickle of hybridization with introgression, and this gene flow being able to make such a big difference in the development of a new lineage. So that, I think, would be fun to discuss with him.
This has come up. Do you remember who it was that we had on not too long ago that also said it's amazing how much Darwin got right?
Yes, yes.
Do you remember who that
Yes.
was? I can't remember what episode that was.
It was Randy Nesse, I think.
It was Randy Nesse, yeah.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, that's right.
evolutionary biologist and psychologist, and
Yes.
we
Yes.
spent some time talking about
Yes,
Darwin.
no,
and,
I mean,
it's just
he
amazing
got-
what he got right.
Well, yes, amazingly so, and then of course Wallace as well. was- yeah.
I think then there's also to be added what was completely unknown in his day. I mean, we think immediately of genetics, and then in particular molecular genetics as we now practice it. But think of what we know about human evolution and the fact that we have fossils to be able to tell us about the course, the multiplication of our ancestors into different lineages, and the Denisovans, the Neanderthals, and what we call ancient Homo sapiens, the so-called Hobbit from Southeast Asia. All of these things would have given him a picture of human evolution that he probably had the barest of sketchy ideas about back in the 1870s.
Yeah. He probably would be amazed by companies like 23andMe.
Yes.
So I just
yes.
recently did this just a couple
did
of
you?
weeks ago. And later on in the fall, we're going to talk to some scientists from 23andMe on the podcast.
Yes.
And sort of go over my genealogical results from
Yes.
that analysis.
And what kind of mixture are you?
About 40% sort of Southern German, which isn't that surprising, and about 30% English, UK, so from around London and Glasgow, and then the rest is sort of Scandinavian writ large.
Yes.
So it's about what you would guess, I think, for a.
And do you have any Neanderthal or
I didn't
Denisovan?
see that part of the analysis. They didn't do that.
Oh, they didn't.
Maybe
do
that's
that.
changed.
Yeah.
They used to
No,
do
they
that.
can.
Yeah.
They can.
Wood's factoid. So in my family, we have these strange bumps on the backs of our heads,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
we always
Yeah.
call them the Neanderthal bump.
Yes.
Yes,
So,
yes. Yeah, we had a friend of ours did this, and she looks, fair-haired, blue-eyed, and you would almost guess what it would come up. But she had actually some Denisovan ancestry. Yes,
Also
I don't-
African.
An African.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
yes.
One
Picked
very
up-
specific group
Yes.
of West African
Yeah.
people have a gene that is characteristic of them and nowhere else.
Yes.
And that fraction of her genome was, in fact, had that signature.
Yes.
Yeah.
Have you both done the 23andMe?
No,
No.
but we're thinking of doing it. Isn't the 23andMe and also Ancestry or something?
And so there's another company now.
Yeah.
There's a few of them that are
Yes.
doing
Yeah.
these sorts
yes,
of things.
so-
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
So
So
It
they,
is a
so they
lot
do
of
an
fun.
ancestral analysis. They also do a health analysis. So that's association between alleles and
Yes, and
particular
things
diseases.
like Alzheimer's and things. Yes.
And the funny thing is, I have those results, and I haven't looked at them yet.
No,
because I'm kind of nervous.
I know.
Like, do I really
yeah,
want to know
I
these things?
I know.
So,
yes. Yes,
anyway.
I would. Yes, but the ancestry part.
Yeah.
What I thought was absolutely delightful to find that the ancient Brits, and of course we're both British, but the ancient Brits were very dark-skinned with blue eyes. Yeah.
Didn't know that.
I
Yeah.
didn't know that either.
Yeah.
So I have to ask, would your invitee for a beer also be Darwin, or
Well,
would you?
I wouldn't have beer.
Beverage of
I
choice.
don't like beer.
Beverage of choice.
But I would have a glass of red wine with him. And yes, it would be Darwin. And just as I think I said before, it would be to discuss the recent genetic work and the introgression work. Of course, there are lots of other people too. Haldane would be a wonderful person to talk to.
Yeah, sure.
And
To listen to.
to
He was such a colourful character
Yeah.
that he was firing off fireworks of wonderful, witty and insightful remarks. He would be the kind of conversationalist that you listen to more than you actually talk to.
But there's also, if you go back even further in time, you can go back to the ancient Greeks, and you can, because they had an idea of evolution or in that time. And although it's put, what is the...
Lucretius.
Lucretius. And in Lucretius's poems, there are these lines that are really is really evolutionary ideas. And it would be extremely nice to go back and talk to Lucretius.
Yeah.
So maybe Lucretius with a glass of wine.
Of wine.
And then,
Excellent.
yes.
I agree. I think a conversation with a person like that would draw out more for your own understanding of what he had in his mind.
Yeah.
The written text that survives tells us that he had, let's say, at least hints of the idea, the principle of natural selection, but they're not so crystally clearly stated that you can say definitely that was the first person in the written record anyway that had the idea of natural selection. So you'd like to cross-examine him a little bit and draw him out into exactly what he has in mind when he wrote what he wrote.
Sure. And what better to do that with him with alcohol? Facilitate the process.
Yeah, I'd add two more people now. I've been thinking about it a little. Two more people that I would add to the list of those I'd like to talk to. One is Wallace. Rosemary's referred to him. He had a very different experience, and yet in many ways similar experience to Darwin's. And the other one is Bates, his companion on the Amazon. Yeah. Both of them writing about their studies and collecting and their interpretation of nature as a result of their observations and collections, I think are wonderful pieces of insightful scientific work that you would call naturalistic, but is undoubtedly scientific. They argued in a way that took several possibilities into account and zeroed in on what they thought was the most likely explanation of a phenomenon by discarding on logical grounds the alternatives. Well, that's the essence of the scientific method. Yeah. We use sounds experiments
early strong
to do
inference,
that now.
Right?
Sorry?
It sounds like early strong inference. So
yes,
we talk a lot about that here in the department, and this sort of method of multiple hypothesis testing. So.
Yeah. And then Humboldt would be another.
Oh, yeah.
We could go on
this
and
would
on
be a fantastic party.
We got to get them all together.
Have them all together. Yeah.
So if you two would like to leave the room and bring in...
We'll invite them, cases of beer and wine. Have a good time. So let's. I think we've been talking about relevant material, of course, but I'm curious to ask what inspired you to become a biologist?
Oh, okay. I grew up in the Lake District in Britain, in a very small village, and it was a most interesting part of the world because it had a lot of Carboniferous limestone, which was full of fossils. And also on that Carboniferous limestone, there were some quite unusual plants growing there. And there were fossils in the garden I grew up in, and I collected fossils in the knot. And I think it was my parents saying, this is what these fossils are, not quite the same as the animals today, but they're very similar, and you could match them up. And so that's what interested me. And also, I very early on became interested in variation within a species. And I think this was because my mother would play a game of trying to find different grasses and what they were, and she was very fond of plants, and especially wild plants. But we had a gardener, and this gardener was his real name was Jeremiah Swindlehurst, and we all called him Jerry. Name. And Jerry was an amazing man. He had never been to school. He taught himself to read and write. He was very erudite. He used to listen to what was the then called the BBC Third Programme, which was a very erudite programme, and they had the Reith lectures, and each year, and he longed for these Reith lectures. So he was an extraordinarily erudite man. He showed me all the birds' nests and the eggs, and he taught me things like how different plants would grow in different conditions and how they had different growth rates. And he was just a fun source of knowledge, and I would hang around with Jerry. And I think that stimulated me. And then going to university, I wanted to, my school was not very inspiring. But at university, the people who were most inspirational was Waddington, who was a geneticist, but also very interested in the environment and also in art, and a very broad person. So so it was this starting part that I always wanted to be a biologist, or I wanted to be something in science from that early part.
You could mention Douglas Faulkner too as being a big
Douglas
influence.
Faulkner was a huge
Quantitative
influence.
geneticist.
Yes, and Charlotte Auerbach was another. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
What about you, Peter?
So my story is somewhat similar. I had a naturalistic background. I don't remember my early childhood very well, but the earliest memory I have is smelling nasturtium flowers. And a very early memory is of catching butterflies with my hand and watching swallows feed after the rain, flying low over the fields and catching insects. And my interest in natural history, as we would then call it, and bird watching and butterfly collecting was fostered by two key teachers at my high school in England. And they basically encouraged me to think about the next step in my career following biology because I was so interested in it. So they were a positive influence in that respect. They could have turned me off if there had been two other teachers. They may have said, well, there's no real career in this subject unless you become a fisheries biologist or a forester or an agricultural worker. But they didn't. No, they encouraged me to be open-ended in my interest in biology. I went to Cambridge University as an undergraduate, and as I have told several people, I thought I was going to become a botanist until I had the first lecture in botany. And enough said about that. And then the next day I had my first lecture in zoology, and it was so wonderfully stimulating. It really directed me down a course of studies in zoological sciences, but not to the exclusion of the plant sciences. Then there were one or two other people at Cambridge who had a big influence on me. We're now talking about why I became a biologist as opposed to why I got into biology. And another one was a famous geneticist, Sidney Brenner, who in 4 lectures gave us all of genetics, and that was absolutely incredible, just an amazing experience. And then I went off into graduate work to the University of British Columbia, and then the last final step that encouraged me to become a professional biologist was taken right at the beginning in the first week or so when I started to teach as a teaching assistant in an introductory biology lab and got the thrill for the first time of being a teacher. Biology was always my interest. Now I found that teaching it gave me the excitement and the feedback that convinced me that this was a worthwhile career to pursue. And then finally, as part of that first week experience was the realization that I could choose my own research and not be told what to do. And that had a terrific appeal, even though I didn't know what I was going to do as research.
The freedom, that freedom makes up for a lot.
Right? And then there's various steps of uncertainty after that. What was I going to do? Got a postdoctoral fellowship. What was I going to do after that? And then finally I got a job. And from then on, I have not looked back or sideways.
Well, you also had Hutchinson.
Yes, I should say, if you were to ask a slightly different question, who were the biologists who inspired me most of all, then I would say Evelyn Hutchinson, who was my mentor as a postdoctoral fellow at Yale, was a terrific influence. He encouraged me to think broadly, to think of big questions. I don't know who it was who said this. But somebody said, if you ask small questions, you will get small answers. If you ask big questions, you may get big answers. Mm-hmm. I don't think it was him who said it, but that more or less was his philosophy. Ask the big questions. Even if you fail, you've had an exciting time and you've probably made some contribution to the solution of your question. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he was an ecologist and a very inspirational one. In terms of biology, I think my major influences, apart from Sidney Brenner's lectures, my major influences came from Ernst Mayr and Julian Huxley, and also David Legge. Mm-hmm.